Welcome. My name is Tom Banchoff. I serve as Vice President for Global Engagement here at Georgetown and as Director of our Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And on behalf of the center, I'm really delighted to welcome you all to our conversation between Tom Gjelten and Randall Balmer on a fascinating topic, Jimmy Carter and the demise of progressive evangelicalism. Tom and Randall, thank you for joining us. I also want to thank two co-sponsors for today's event, the Georgetown Journalism Program and the College of Arts and Sciences, and the Georgetown Center on Faith and Justice. And Jim Wallace is here with us today representing the center. Today we're going to look back at what I think, and I think you'll all agree, was a fascinating juncture in American political and religious history, something in living memory for some of us. How Jimmy Carter, who lived and worked and also passed away with such dignity, how he embodied a fascinating strand of progressive evangelicalism in the United States, and what became of that current. And we're really fortunate to have Randall, whose 2014 book entitled Redeemer, The Life of Jimmy Carter, really set the standard. We have copies here out front. The book was reissued just last year. To have him in conversation with Tom Gjelten, one of the nation's leading journalists and experts on faith and public life, to engage with you all in this conversation. Now, before I give them a proper introduction, just a little context about this gathering. It's hard these days to tee up any topic, even maybe especially a historic topic, without reference to our current historic moment. Carter's commitment to social justice, to racial justice, to the global common good, all fired by his Southern Baptist faith, represented a current in American political life that has long been eclipsed if we look around at our religious and political landscape today. It's still there, but eclipsed. But I would argue, and I think this may be the spirit of our conversation, that his legacy also represents a resource as we try to think and act our way out of the current crisis, a crisis marked by so many deep divisions and too often by an aggressively nationalist and xenophobic religious voice and voices. A look back provides a critical lens on our present, and I think a way to look forward even with hope. So, like you all, really looking forward to this conversation. Randall Balmer is the John Phillips Chair in Religion at Dartmouth College, a leading scholar of American religious history and the author of more than a dozen influential books. In addition to The Redeemer, which I just mentioned, let me recall just two other titles: Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right from 2021, and Saving Faith, How American Christianity Can Reclaim Its Prophetic Voice from 2023. After earning his PhD from Princeton, he taught American religious history at Columbia for 27 years before arriving at Dartmouth. He's been a visiting professor at Princeton, Yale, Northwestern, Emory, as well as at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Tom Gjelten, who's had a long and accomplished career in journalism, most recently as a religion and belief correspondent at National Public Radio, has joined Georgetown, our community, this semester as our first Sakka Family Religion and International Journalism Fellow. Tom's nearly four-decade NPR career also includes overseas reporting from far-flung places around the world, including coverage of U.S. foreign and security policy as it's made here in Washington, D.C. He's the author of many books, including Sarajevo Daily, A City and Its Newspaper Under Siege from 1996, and A Nation of Nations, A Great American Immigration Story from 2015. He's the recipient of many awards and serves on the Council on Foreign Relations. And Tom, we're really delighted to have you as part of our Georgetown community. So thank you both for being here, and please join me in giving them both a warm welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Tom. And thanks for setting this discussion so aptly in context. We're at this moment where the intersection of sort of evangelical thought and partisan politics is a huge subject. And I think what makes this conversation today so interesting is that it is at a very different point in the evolution of evangelical thinking. Because for many, many years, as Randall will explain, Christian evangelicals in the United States were actually associated with progressive causes. They were in the forefront in the abolitionist movement. They supported women's rights and workers' rights and advocated for social and economic justice. And Randall, you have argued that Jimmy Carter was the last progressive evangelical. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We should point out, and I'm sure you won't disagree with this, he wasn't the last progressive evangelical sort of. We have Jim Wallace here, who's a progressive evangelical, and he's still with us. But what did you mean when you said that Jimmy Carter is the last progressive evangelical?
Well, that's a bit hyperbolic, I acknowledge that. We have people like Jim Wallace and others. We just lost Tony Campolo recently, who would fit into that category. And even in politics, I would argue that probably the real last progressive evangelical in national politics was Mark Hatfield.
And you're writing a new book on
I'm writing a biography on Mark Hatfield right now. Extraordinary man.
Yeah.
And very much in that tradition, Baptist and evangelical, cared about the separation of church and state, as of course did Jimmy Carter. Even though they were from two different parties, Hatfield was a Republican and Carter, of course, a Democrat. They were both part of that tradition.
Let's talk a little bit about your encounter with the tradition of progressive evangelicalism. It came, as I understand it, when you were a college student at Trinity Christian College in Illinois.
Trinity College in Deerfield, Illinois, yes.
Yeah.
This is a school that was associated also with Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, where Jim and I both were students. And I began to learn at that time more about my own past. My father was a minister for 40 years in the Evangelical Free Church, the denomination that supported both those schools. And of course, I grew up within that tradition. And it was while I was a student at Trinity College that I began to understand a little bit more about this whole tradition of progressive evangelicalism and became fascinated by it.
Yeah. And this was in the early 1970s. I'm from that era, and a few of us are, and I know it was a time of activism and rising social awareness, and that infected you as a college student.
It did very much. I was very much involved in the 1972 campaign with George McGovern, a rather lost cause. But I think that 1970s were formative for this whole strain of progressive evangelicalism. You had the McGovern campaign, which of course he lost to Richard Nixon. But a year later, Ronald Sider, together with Jim Wallace and I believe a total of 55 evangelical theologians, gathered in Chicago at the YMCA Hotel and hammered out this remarkable document called the Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern. It's available on the internet. You can look at it for yourself. Make sure you look for the 1973 version of this. But what's striking about that declaration was that it was trying to reclaim what you were talking about earlier, the 19th century vision for evangelicalism and social reform. And if you look at it, it's really quite distinguished. Evangelicals were very much involved in the temperance movement. We can kind of set that aside. It was a progressive cause in the 19th century. We view it today as paternalistic and overweening, but at the time it was addressing a real problem. They were also involved in prison reform. They advocated for women's equality, including voting rights, which was considered a radical idea in the 19th century. They were involved in the formation of what they called at the time common schools, public education, because they realized that was the way for those in the lower rungs of society to become upwardly mobile. And they were very much in favor of that. Charles Grandison Finney, by any measure, the most important and consequential evangelical of the 19th century, also excoriated free market capitalism. He said that, these are my words, not his, but a Christian businessman was an oxymoron because business necessarily elevated avarice over altruism. Again, that's my characterization, but that's pretty close to his sentiment.
What was the theological basis for those views?
I would say the New Testament, the Sermon on the Mount, certainly Matthew 25, where Jesus calls on his followers to care for the least of these. And this was very much animating 19th century evangelicalism. And so the Chicago Declaration was a remarkable restatement of those principles, obviously adjusted for the times. So, for example, there was a strong statement against militarism. This was toward the end of the Vietnam War, of course, but also the Declaration lamented the persistence of hunger in an affluent society, the persistence of racism in American society, and again, a rather remarkable statement about women's equality in that Chicago Declaration. So you have that Chicago Declaration in 1973, and then on December 12th, 1974, I should go back in May of 1974, the governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter, addresses the Law Day crowd at the University of Georgia Law School. And he issues, he speaks extemporaneously, and he talks about his understanding of justice. He said that his understanding of justice was informed by two sources. One was the venerable theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who often talked about politics as the sad duty of politics was to establish justice in a sinful world. And the other venerable theologian he quoted was Bob Dylan. Especially Bob Dylan's song, Ain't Gonna Work on Maggie's Farm No More, which talked about the plight of tenant farmers. And of course, that was a very famous address because Hunter Thompson of Rolling Stone magazine was there covering the event. He wrote it up, and that helped to propel Jimmy Carter to national attention. And then December 12th, 1974, Jimmy Carter announces his candidacy for the Democratic nomination. So, and then I think the election of Carter in 1976 represents in many ways the zenith of progressive evangelicalism in the 1970s. And then, of course, Carter's defeat 4 years later, I think, represents the...
At that moment when he was elected, evangelicals, even theologically conservative evangelicals, saw him as one of their own.
They did. Actually, Ford and Carter drew roughly the same percentage of evangelical voters, but it was still far greater percentage for Carter than any Democrat had before that. And it's also important to remember that evangelicals at that time were really coming out of roughly half a century of apolitical torpor. That is to say, going back to the Scopes trial of 1925, and I don't want to put too much emphasis on the trial itself, but it was a symbolic moment when evangelicals began to withdraw from the larger society and were not involved in politics. Many not even registered to vote. And again, I grew up in that era myself, and I remember that my first year as a freshman at Trinity College, trying to get my classmates interested in politics, and they just weren't. They were apolitical. So Carter comes on the scene, 74, 75 to national attention. And I remember this again very clearly as an undergraduate at the time. This guy is speaking our language. He's talking about himself as a born-again Christian, which is how we used to describe ourselves. But we were always kind of furtive about it. We were kind of sheepish. And he was forthright about being a born-again Christian, and that caught our attention, and that's, I think, the reason that many evangelicals voted for him.
He was a born-again Christian. He actually, you write in your book that he at one point even led a revival meeting in the kind of a Billy Graham style where he calls on people to come forward and accept Jesus Christ. What are some of the other crucial defining elements of evangelicalism, in terms of their religious beliefs?
Sure. I have a three-part definition. An evangelical is somebody who regards the Bible as God's revelation to humanity, and therefore it should be taken seriously to the point of literal interpretation. Although I always
Inerrancy, even.
Yeah, that's a whole other conversation. We can get into that if you wish. I often add that evangelicals engage in what I call the ruse of selective literalism when it comes to the Bible, but we all do. Let's be clear about that. Secondly, an evangelical is someone who believes in the centrality of a conversion or a born-again experience. And the term comes from the 3rd chapter of St. John in the New Testament, when Nicodemus, a Jewish leader, visits Jesus by night and asks Jesus how he, Nicodemus, can enter the kingdom of heaven. Jesus replies, "You must be born again," or in some translations, born from above. And the third definition is what you just alluded to, that is the impulse to bring others into the fold, to evangelize. And so I think what's really striking about Jimmy Carter is certainly he had his born-again experience, but he also acted on it. As you said, he was actually the chair of the local Billy Graham crusade there in southwestern Georgia. But also, after his recommitment of his life to Jesus following the 1966 gubernatorial election where he lost to, of all people, Lester Maddox, after that, he went actually on evangelism sorties to Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, and later to Springfield, Massachusetts, together with other Southern Baptist laymen. And they actually went around knocking on doors, telling people about Jesus. The first time I met Mr. Carter was prior to an event at Emory University, this is now some years ago. And what he wanted to talk about on that occasion is what he called the unsurpassed joy of telling other people about Jesus. So he was serious. He was an evangelical, and he was serious about it.
Now, one of the things that makes his story interesting is that he's from the South, and you all know that Southern Baptists originated as a denomination as a very deliberate split from Northern Baptists over the issue of slavery originally.
1845, yeah.
And you had theologians like James Henley Thornwell, who actually advocated for slavery. So there was a tradition in Southern evangelicalism that he very deliberately distanced himself from.
He did, and I have to say that, in all fairness, his record on race early in his career was mixed, and we have to be clear about that.
In your 1970 campaign.
That's right. By the way, one of the reasons I called the book Redeemer is that I think there are 3 instances where Jimmy Carter acted as a redeemer, and one of the instances was after the 1970 campaign, where toward the end of the campaign, he did court the white supremacist vote. Yeah. And he immediately felt bad about it. And so when he was inaugurated as governor of Georgia on January 12, 1971, he famously said that the time for racial segregation is over. And then he followed through on that. And I don't think there's any evidence after that he trafficked in racialized rhetoric.
Yeah.
He was clean after that, I think, on that issue, certainly.
Yeah. Talk a little bit more about where evangelicalism was at politically in 1976 that explains why Jimmy Carter could be elected. I mean, we later came to think of abortion as a mobilizing issue. Why were the issues that we have come to associate with evangelicalism, why weren't they so salient in 1976?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think in 1976, many evangelicals voted for Jimmy Carter, in part out of the kind of novelty of being able to vote for one of their own. And I think it's fair to say that many of them were not terribly politically sophisticated at that time in 1976. So again, being able to vote for a fellow born-again evangelical Christian was really quite remarkable. What happens to that movement is fascinating, and the standard narrative that has been repeated countless times by the televangelists is that they became politically active in the 1970s in direct response to the Roe v. Wade decision of January 22nd, 1973. I've spent, Tom,
You're not convinced of that.
far too many years trying to validate that claim, or in fact to invalidate that claim. And I can say without worry of contradiction, abortion had nothing to do with the mobilization of evangelical voters in the 1970s. They considered abortion to be a Catholic issue until the very late 1970s, just really on the eve of the 1980 presidential election. And again, I can get going on this. You can wave me off if you want, but let me just give you some evidence on this. I call it the abortion myth. The abortion myth is the fiction that evangelicals became politically engaged in the 1970s in response to Roe v. Wade. 1968, Christianity Today, the flagship magazine for evangelicalism, together with another group called the Christian Medical Society, convened a conference to talk about the ethics surrounding abortion. And 26 heavyweight evangelical theologians gathered for several days, hash out this issue. They issued a statement at the end of their meeting saying, we can't agree on whether or not abortion is morally wrong, but we think it should be available. 1971, the Southern Baptist Convention, not exactly a redoubt of liberalism, passed a resolution calling for the legalization of abortion, which they reaffirmed in 1974 and again in 1976. Jerry Falwell, by his own admission, did not preach his first anti-abortion sermon until February 26, 1978. That's more than 5 years after the Roe v. Wade decision. Mm-hmm. I'll add one more. I could keep going, so I don't want to commandeer the conversation here. But when the Roe v. Wade decision was handed down, W.A. Criswell.
I was going to mention him, because he's an arch white supremacist preacher.
Absolutely. W.A. Criswell, former president of the Southern Baptist Convention, pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas, where Robert Jefferson is now, issued a statement applauding the Roe v. Wade decision as marking an appropriate distinction between personal morality and public policy. That's why I call it the abortion myth. So it raises the question, what happened? The real catalyst, and this is according to Paul Weyrich and other leaders of the religious right. Paul Weyrich was really the architect of the religious right. What mobilized evangelicals politically in the 1970s was the Internal Revenue Service challenging the tax exemption of places like Bob Jones University and Liberty Christian Academy, which was Jerry Falwell's segregation academy in Lynchburg, Virginia. The basis for this was a court decision, but it wasn't Roe v. Wade. It was a court decision called Green v. Connolly that was handed down by the District Court for the District of Columbia on June 30th, 1971. And by the way, one of the reasons that that's not better known is that was the same day that the Supreme Court issued its decision on the Pentagon Papers, so that it got kind of lost in the news. The background for Green v. Connolly, and I'll try to be quick here, was desegregation in Holmes County, Mississippi. The first year of desegregation, the number of white students in the Holmes County public schools dropped from 771 to 28. The second year of desegregation, that number dropped to 0. At the same time, 3 segregation academies, church-sponsored, applied to the Internal Revenue Service for tax-exempt status. And a group of parents in Holmes County, Mississippi said, this isn't right. They challenged it. That case was tied to another case. It went through the court system and finally ended up before the district court here in District of Columbia. And the decision on June 30th, 1971 was effectively that any organization that engaged in racial segregation or racial discrimination on the basis of the Brown v. Board of Education decision of 1954, but also the Civil Rights Act of 1964, was not by definition a charitable institution, and therefore no longer qualified for tax-exempt status. And as the Internal Revenue Service began to enforce that decision over the course of the 1970s, that got the attention of people like Jerry Falwell, who wanted to defend his own school. And that was the catalyst for the religious right. It had nothing to do with abortion.
Your argument in that regard is pretty convincing. Nevertheless, abortion did become a mobilizing issue. The conservative evangelicals did seize on abortion.
Yep.
And how, why, when did that happen?
It really happened in the midterm elections of 1978.
78.
Paul Weyrich, who again was the architect of the religious right, went to the head of the Republican National Committee in advance of the 1978 midterm elections. At that time it was Bill Brock, former Republican senator from Tennessee. And he asked for money to help mobilize evangelical voters. And Weyrich, by the way, and he told me this directly. He said, I'd been trying to get these people organized, meaning evangelical voters, white evangelical voters, since the Goldwater campaign in 1964. He said, I tried everything. I tried the school prayer issue, I tried the abortion issue, I tried the pornography issue, I tried the women's rights issue. Nothing got their attention until the IRS started to challenge the tax exemption status of these schools in the 1970s. So, back to the narrative. Weyrich went to Bill Brock and asked for money to help mobilize these evangelical voters. And according to Weyrich, Brock stared across the desk at him and said, who are these people? I'm not going to give you money for this sort of thing. Whereupon Weyrich, again according to his own account, resolved to go out and elect some unlikely people in 1978. He focused on 4 Senate races. Thomas McIntyre running for re-election in New Hampshire, Dick Clark running for re-election in Iowa, and 2 Senate races in Minnesota, one of them for the unexpired term of Walter Mondale, who was Carter's vice president. On the final weekend of that campaign, pro-lifers, Roman Catholics, leafleted church parking lots. And 2 days later, in an election with a very low turnout, all 4 Democratic nominees who were overwhelmingly favored going into that election lost to anti-abortion Republicans. I remember reading through Weyrich's papers, which actually are at the University of Wyoming in Laramie for some reason. It's a long story. And coming across his correspondence surrounding that midterm election in 1978, it's almost like the papers started to levitate off the desk. He finally found an issue that would motivate grassroots evangelicals. And Weyrich was savvy enough to recognize that defense of racial segregation might have worked for people like Falwell and the leaders of the movement, but if he really wanted grassroots evangelicals, he needed another issue other than a defense of segregation. And that's how abortion got cobbled into the agenda of the religious right. Just to finish that up, 2 months later, after the midterm elections in 1978, a film series started to circulate around the country, particularly among evangelical audiences. It was produced by a man named Frank Schaeffer, who's still around and can attest to this, but it featured his father, Francis Schaeffer, who was kind of the intellectual godfather of the religious right, and a pediatric surgeon from Philadelphia named C. Everett Koop, called Whatever Happened to the Human Race, which argued that any society that countenanced abortion would very soon thereafter also allow euthanasia and infanticide. And as that film series began to circulate, it began to really resonate with a lot of evangelical voters. Nevertheless, as late as August 22nd, 1980, when Ronald Reagan addressed the National Affairs briefing in Dallas at Reunion Center, I read through his speech out at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California. He talked about creationism. He excoriated Jimmy Carter's Internal Revenue Service for challenging the tax exemption of these schools.
Which wasn't quite correct.
It was not correct.
It predated Jimmy Carter.
Yes, exactly. I'll come back to that in a second. But Reagan's address before 10 to 20,000 riled up evangelical voters did not mention abortion once in that speech. Yes, you're absolutely right. The Green v. Connolly decision was handed down in 1971. Of course, Richard Nixon was president, at which time Nixon instructed the Internal Revenue Service not to grant further tax exemption to segregated schools. So it was really Nixon.
Yeah.
Gerald Ford concurred, and then it was, of course, during Carter's time as president that the IRS began to enforce it. And I asked Mr. Carter if he was aware that this was going on. He said no, he wasn't. He wanted to stay out of the IRS because Nixon had been so complicit with the IRS. He wanted to stay away from that. So yes, you're absolutely right. And in the 1980, I know I'm going on and on here, I apologize, but during the 1980 campaign, Carter was blamed for the rescission of the tax-exempt status at Bob Jones University, which occurred on January 19th, 1976. Now, that date was important for Carter, but not because he had anything to do with Bob Jones University losing its tax exemption. That was the day he won a plurality at the Iowa precinct caucuses. He didn't become president until a year and a day later,
Sure.
And yet the religious right tried to blame him.
Yeah. I want to pick up in a few minutes with sort of where political evangelicalism has gone in the last 50 years, but just to finish with Jimmy Carter and his legacy. You talk in Redeemer about Jimmy Carter's accomplishments, and you do seem to think he was a good president, but you also say that was not your main point of your book. And you acknowledge that there have been a lot of people that have criticized the Carter presidency. You write in your book that you have little interest in rehabilitating Carter's political reputation. And then you go on to quote Billy Graham as having said he'd rather have a man in office who is highly qualified to be president, who didn't make much of his religious profession, than to have a man who had no qualifications but who made a religious profession. You quote James Robinson, a televangelist, saying about Carter, no one was talking about Jimmy Carter's faith. It was his ability to lead. You even quote James Falwell, who's continues to be a prominent journalist, saying that Carter failed to translate his personal qualities into an effective style of governing. It seems to me the key question here is, are you saying that being a good Christian does not necessarily mean being a good president, or conversely, that being a bad Christian doesn't necessarily mean you'd be a bad president?
Oh, that sounds like a trap to me.
That's why you make the big bucks.
That's right. I'm going to sidestep that a little bit by saying that I think there were certain personal characteristics that Carter had that probably attenuated his effectiveness as president. He was a micromanager. He tried, in our conversations, he tried to deny it, but I think there's evidence is pretty strong that he was a micromanager and was not entirely comfortable delegating authority. I think that was one of the things. He could be very inflexible. Jimmy Carter was a moralist, I think, in many ways, and I think there's a part of me that admires somebody who's a moralist because he's somebody who stands on principle, but he could be pretty inflexible at times. In an early draft that he read, of the introduction at least, I had said that he had not had a good relationship with Congress, but he took issue with that. He said, no, I had a good relationship. And then he cited some study that indicated that he had been fairly effective in his dealings with Congress. In terms of faith being an impediment to one's effectiveness as a politician or as a president, I think Carter himself would disagree with that. And again, I think there are other reasons. I mean, he was adamant that politics ended at the door to the Oval Office, and Several of his aides have said that the surest way to get a proposal shot down by Mr. Carter was to argue that it was politically advantageous for him.
Really?
He just refused to make decisions on that basis. So I think it was probably other things rather than his faith or his lack of faith. And again, I'm not sure that any president in the late 1970s would be considered successful. You think of the headwinds, the inflation because of the Arab oil embargo, the taking of the hostages. 1979 for Carter was just as horrible, terrible, very bad year. And nothing went right for him in 1979. 3 Mile Island, disco night in Kaminsky Park in Chicago. I mean, everything was just going wrong for him. And I'm not sure any politician would have survived. Historians like to sometimes frame counterfactual questions. And one that kind of intrigues me is that you'll remember that in 1976, Reagan challenged Ford for the Republican nomination, came very close to winning the nomination from Gerald Ford. And I've often speculated, had Reagan won the nomination and been elected president in 1976, given the headwinds that any president was facing late in the 1970s, would he have been considered a successful president or even a two-term president at that point? I'm not sure.
Now, you say that, I mean, the title of your book is Redeemer. And one of the arguments you make is that Carter's election in 1976 was seen as a kind of a redemptive moment for the country in the aftermath of Nixon. And I think he used the phrase, he provided a moral compass at a time when the country really needed somebody in office who represented that morality.
I think that's right. I think that's another of my books is called God in the White House, where I looked at the faith of presidents from Kennedy to George W. Bush. And what I argue in that book is that Kennedy faced the so-called religious issue in 1960, actually on September 12th down in Houston at the Ministerial Association, when he gave his famous address about, I'm not the Catholic candidate for president, I am the Democratic nominee for president who happens to be Catholic. And what he was arguing is that voters should bracket out a candidate's faith when they went into the voting booth. And I think that argument held sway in presidential politics for several cycles. And the way I used to test this when I was promoting that book was to ask members of the audience, what was Lyndon Johnson's religious affiliation? And most people, well, I'm Baptist, I suppose. It's actually Disciples of Christ. But my point was, nobody paid attention to it at that time. When Romney was running for the Republican nomination in '68, he wanted to talk about his Mormon faith. Nobody wanted to talk about it. And I think Nixon changed that. That is to say that after Watergate, after the Nixon administration scandals, Americans all of a sudden wanted to know that their politicians, their presidential candidates, had a moral compass. And along comes Jimmy Carter, a Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher. You can't get any more religious than that. And I think that's one of the reasons that he was elected. And in terms of being a redeemer, yes, I think he helped to pull the nation out of the doldrums of Watergate. But also, let's remember, his first official act as president was to pardon Vietnam-era draft resistors as a way of trying to put that behind us. And I think in that sense, he was functioning as a redeemer.
And 20 years later, you had George W. Bush becoming president, who made a very big issue of his Christian faith.
Yes, he did. Right, that's right. That's right, yeah. I get a kick out of reading historians, including some of my good friends who say that George W. Bush was the first evangelical president. No.
Right. He was an evangelical of a somewhat different sort.
Yes.
Although in hindsight, he's probably closer to Jimmy Carter than Donald Trump, right? You could make that argument, I suppose.
I'd be prepared to make that argument.
Let's talk a little bit about how evangelicalism has evolved over these last 40 years. Your new book, which It's not actually out yet. Randall just got a copy of it. It's America's Best Idea, the separation of church and state. That's become a issue of great dispute right now. We can also talk about the rise of Christian nationalism. But so why don't you kind of describe what some of the tenets of right-wing evangelical thinking in political terms, where it stands today?
Good question. It's a big question.
Yeah, it's a big question.
I guess I would probably point back to the Carter era as being pivotal. Certainly the election in 1980 moved the country in a different direction. But a year before that, you have the conservative takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention in June of 1979. And throughout American history, up until that time, we could kind of look to the Baptists, and particularly the Southern Baptists, to be kind of the watchmen on the wall of separation between church and state.
And why is that? I mean, it's sort of counterintuitive to say.
Well, exactly, right. But it's part of the whole Baptist tradition.
Roger Williams.
Roger Williams, the founder of the Baptist tradition in America, believed fervently in, as did other Baptists back in England, in separation of church and state and liberty of conscience. And what I like to point out about this, we're so familiar with this metaphor about separation of church and state, but Roger Williams argued to separate the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world by means of a wall of separation. And what I think we folks in the 21st century fail to appreciate about that metaphor is that Roger Williams and his contemporaries were not members of the Sierra Club. That is to say, they didn't share our romantic notions about wilderness. So when he talks about protecting the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world, his concern was to maintain the integrity of the faith from too close an association with the state. And I think we've lost sight of that. And certainly the Southern Baptists and many other Baptists after 1979 have lost sight of that. And I really worry about this. I think, as the title suggests, I think the First Amendment is America's best idea because it has led to the flourishing of religion in America. We are an incurably religious people, and it's precisely because the government, for the most part, has stayed out of the religion business. Probably the most famous publication of 1776 was not the Declaration of Independence. It was a book called The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, his brief for free market capitalism. But one of the examples he uses in that book, it's a massive tome, I used to teach it when I was at Columbia, was if religion were untethered from the government, religion would flourish. And I think the American experience over 2 centuries of the First Amendment has vindicated that claim. We have a salubrious, vibrant religious culture precisely because of the First Amendment. And I have to say that what baffles me even now is why people who claim to be people of faith, people who are religious, are trying to erode that line of separation or the wall of separation between church and state. It's against their own interests, ultimately, but I guess they don't see that.
But part of the First Amendment says that there shouldn't be any abridgment of the right to exercise
Free exercise.
religion,
Yeah,
the free exercise clause. Right. And that's the part that seems to motivate a lot of those who are now arguing that any kind of intrusion on school prayer or religious practice in public spaces is a violation of that part of the First Amendment.
Well, Mark Hatfield, I think, addressed that really well when Jesse Helms introduced an amendment in the Senate to a spending bill that required prayer in public schools. And Mark Hatfield, an evangelical, a Baptist, stood up and he said, let's be clear, no one has ever said you can't pray in school. He said, I prayed in school all the time, especially during math tests. And nobody's ever said you can't pray. The issue is prescribed prayer in public education. And that, I think, is a clear violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment.
Yeah. But we now see move after move after move. Now the Supreme Court is going to be dealing on public funding of religious charter schools, for example.
I wish this court had half as much deference for the First Amendment as it does for the Second Amendment. I really worry about where we're heading on this. And consistently to whittle away at the First Amendment, as they've done in the Montana decision, the Maine decision, I think is really perilous.
Yeah. Now, related to this is the rise of what's called Christian nationalism. Yes. What do you see happening there, particularly now with this new administration?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about it as Christian nationalism itself. I think it can be refuted on 3 grounds. The first is theological.
How do you define it, first of all?
The way they define it, as I understand, is to assert that the United States is and always has been a Christian nation and should continue to be a Christian nation. I mean, that's be a quick definition of it. But theologically, Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." End of conversation. Why are we talking about this? There's also, as you know, I'm an Episcopal priest, so I preach from time to time. And recently I was noticing in the lectionary, between 2 very well-known passages, one is the feeding of the 5,000, and the second is Jesus walking on the Sea of Galilee. There's a verse that says that Jesus said that he sensed that the crowd wanted to make him king. And what did he do? He went up into the wilderness because he didn't want to be king. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, unto God the things that are God's. And we could debate the meaning of that, but at least it talks about 2 separate realms, it seems to me. Historically, the Christian nationalism rests on the fallacy that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. David Barton, who's responsible probably as much as anybody for this mischief, has asserted something like 53 out of the 55 founders were evangelical Christians, which is just preposterous. Yeah. I mean, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, I mean, it's just preposterous. I like to say that with a possible exception of John Witherspoon, who was a Presbyterian minister and president of the College in New Jersey, and his name is the physician, Benjamin Rush, with the possible exception of those 2 founders, none of the founders would be welcome as members of any of the churches now advocating for Christian nationalism. It's just preposterous. The Treaty of Tripoli, another example. Treaty of Tripoli was negotiated at the end of George Washington's administration, sent to the Senate for ratification by John Adams with his endorsement, read aloud before the Senate, and ratified unanimously by the United States Senate on July 7th, 1797. Article 11 reads, I'm going to paraphrase, but it's pretty close. The United States is not in any sense founded as a Christian religion, Christian nation. Or, I'm sorry, the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. That's pretty clear. There have been various attempts throughout history, American history, to amend the Constitution to add Christianity into it, and those have all faltered, thankfully. So that's the second ground. The third, I think, is practical, what I just said. The First Amendment, disestablishment, has worked very well for religion. And Christian nationalism is a worry. I am very worried about that, particularly with the Supreme Court right now. But it really has no foundation, I think, either theologically or historically. Yeah.
Well, we can't conclude this discussion without talking about President Trump's support among white evangelicals. I think he got, the data are a little bit in dispute, but somewhere around 80% of white evangelicals voted for him in this past election. And it's become a cliche to point out how many times he's been divorced, known to have consorted with porn star. He uses profanity. He seems to enjoy insulting people and yet overwhelming support for white evangelicals.
Yeah.
You have an explanation for that phenomenon?
I can try. Yeah, it mystifies me as well. I think what part of his appeal is the rhetoric of victimization. And evangelicals like to see themselves as victims. And they have all the way going back to this, arguably to the Scopes trial in 1925. One of the reasons for the rise and the success of the religious right, I think, is that the leaders were constantly using this rhetoric of victimization. Our values are under attack. We're the ones who are marginal in the society. We're, all indices to the contrary. They hold on to that sort of that rhetoric. And so, and no one in my lifetime speaks the language of victimization with greater clarity than Donald Trump. Now, it's always about him. He's the victim, of course. But I think there's some sort of almost visceral way in which evangelicals identify with that vocabulary, with that language. I think that's one factor. I think another factor goes back to the origins of the religious right. And there's no pretty way to say this, but the origins of the religious right are racism. And I suppose we can have a discussion about whether or not Trump is racist, but I think the evidence is pretty clear there for at least most people. And I have to say that the link between the two is Reagan. Reagan got started in politics in opposition to the Rumford Fair Housing Act in California in 1963, which sought to open housing to racial minorities, whether renting or purchase. He was an outspoken opponent of both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Throughout his political campaigns, he employed the racist dog whistles about law and order and so forth. Welfare queens, women of color who were living off the public dole in lives of luxury. He could never identify one, but he was sure they existed. Even as the apartheid regime in South Africa was crumbling beneath its own weight, he continued to express support for that. He decimated the Civil Rights Commission. So I think there's a loop. There's a
Continuity.
A line between those two, Donald Trump and the origins of the religious right, and it loops through Reagan, I'm afraid.
Speaking of the victimization idea, going back as far as I think you wrote about the Conference on Families, there was a feeling among religious, conservative religious people that they were out of power. Yeah. The desire for power became much more important motivating factor. Is it Cyrus that so many religious conservative evangelicals look to? Somebody who is not sort of great noble character, but brought people to power. And you see Trump as being someone who can empower them.
Right, that's right. Yeah, and again, and I think that's the wrong course for people of faith. My sense of American religious history is that religion always functions best on the margins and not in the councils of power. Once you begin to hanker after political power or cultural power or influence, I think you lose your prophetic voice. And that, I think, is a kind of digest of what has happened to white evangelicalism over the last half century with the religious right.
I'm looking for, you actually have something, you say that, very similar to what you just said, once a religious group panders after political influence, it loses its prophetic voice. You wrote that sort of with reference to the religious right. Would it apply also to the religious left, if there is such a thing?
Well, if they ever sniffed power, I suppose it would. I think it applies to any group. I think you always have to be Jacques Ellul actually was very, very good about this, saying that if you're involved in politics, you support the underdog, you support the marginal people, and then once those people ascend to power, then you again switch over to the underdog. I think there's a case to be made for that.
So Randall, you are, as we've mentioned, you are yourself an ordained Episcopal priest. Mm-hmm. Can you, you said you do give sermons from time to time, homilies. Can you talk a little bit about that part of your life?
I was ordained fairly late in life. I was about 50 years old when I was ordained, and then
were you still affiliated with the Evangelical Free Church up until then?
No, I kind of drifted away from that. I think I discovered the Episcopal Church when I was in graduate school. Actually, I have two semi-flippant responses when people ask how somebody who was reared a fundamentalist became an Episcopalian. One, it was a reaction to the aesthetic deprivation of my childhood. And second, I grew tired of the cult of novelty. Evangelicals always are, let's try something new. And I always want to say, no, let's try something old and connect with traditions. And that's been very important to me. So when I was still at Columbia, I was actually rector of a parish in Connecticut while still teaching at Columbia, and then another parish in central Connecticut. And then when I came up to Dartmouth in 2012, I've been doing mostly supply work, filling in for people, sometimes on a long-term basis, but often from Sunday to Sunday, going to different places.
And how receptive do you find the people that you, in the congregations you visit, are to sort of a faith message these days?
A faith message?
A faith message.
I think they are fairly receptive. It's hard to say. And being up in New Hampshire and Vermont, the parishes are pretty small, I have to say, and dying, quite literally dying. That I find discouraging. I would love to see these parishes, mainline Protestantism in general, serve as a kind of communal gathering place for people who are concerned about the direction of the culture of the country. The infrastructure is there. It seems to me it's a moment worth seizing, and I think there's some evidence that there's a bit of a rebound in some of these communities. So yes, I see some signs of hope. I also think, as a Christian, I think hope is a mandate. I have to say that I think we're living in some fairly dark times politically right now. And I don't mean that as a partisan message, although I'm sure it will be taken as such. But a few years ago, somebody asked me to write an essay about hope, which of course is one of the three theological virtues at the end of 1 Corinthians 13 in the New Testament: faith, hope, and love. Mm-hmm. And it occurred to me that we talk a lot about faith. We certainly talk about a lot about love in this culture. We don't talk much about hope. It also occurred to me that of those three theological virtues, hope is the only one that's volitional. That is to say, I can choose to be hopeful. I can't choose faith necessarily. Love is pretty hard to choose. It kind of chooses you. But hope is volitional. I can choose to be hopeful. And I think it's a mandate these days to be hopeful. And even though I struggle some mornings to be hopeful, I try to hold on to that.
Well, that concept was certainly key to Barack Obama's election.
Yes, right. Yeah.
I mean, that was his thing.
That was his tagline, that's right. Yeah.
You know, there's been a lot of talk about the rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. And Ryan Burge, who's a sociologist of religion in Illinois, is probably more associated with that than anyone else. But his recent research suggests that has now plateaued.
Plateaued, yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
And you got an explanation for
Well, I think it may be what's happening politically. Actually, I did an event up at Boston College just last week, and just informally around dinner, a lot of folks were talking about their parishes, and they're seeing a rise in at least people attending church services, which they attributed in turn to the fact that we need to kind of pull together at this moment. So perhaps that's why, I don't know.
Well, I'd like to involve the rest of you in this conversation now. We have Jim Wallace here, who's a Latter-day progressive evangelical. Right. We got Paul Eli, who's one of your former students at Columbia. Yep. We've got a number of people here who have a lot to offer to this conversation. So rather than just have the two of us prattle on for a while, I'd like to hear some thoughts from those of you.
I have a question.
Yep. Why don't you wait for the microphone? Yep.
Did you in fact write that essay on hope?
I did.
And where is it?
I don't know.
What's it called, Hope?
I think it was just called Hope.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I don't remember where. It was a kind of a fairly obscure journal on spirituality, kind of a spirituality magazine sort of thing, as I recall. I can look it up for you, though.
Tom and Paul. Yeah.
Thanks for the wonderful conversation. Jimmy Carter is a fascinating person, and you've written about him very eloquently. Could you talk about the role of doubt in his life? When did he express doubt? You mentioned the tough years of his presidency. What can we learn from his grappling with doubt?
That's great. I think his real crisis occurred after the 1966 race for governor, when he lost to Lester Maddox. And Carter was running as, at that time, he would have been considered a racial moderate in the South. And subsequently, he really became, in many ways, the face of the New South, the so-called post-racial South. And after that election, people in Plains, Georgia would see him kind of wandering around town, with his head down, dejected. And he fought with God, I think it's fair to say at that time. How could this happen? Here I am, running on all the right principles, and I get slammed down by this crude racist, Lester Maddox. I don't know if you remember that character, but Maddox became prominent in Georgia actually the day after Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Maddox had a restaurant called Pickrick Restaurant in Atlanta, and several African-American young men were trying to come and eat in his restaurant after the Civil Rights Act was signed. And he intercepted them in the parking lot with an axe handle and threatened them. And that became made him notorious. And he would actually sell axe handles at his restaurant. And he used that to propel himself to the governorship of Georgia. So Carter gets defeated by Lester Maddox. And he's dejected. He's utterly disconsolate about that. And then his sister, who you recall was a Pentecostal evangelist, Ruth Carter Stapleton, came to visit him, and they had a long walk. And the two accounts differed a little bit, but what has clearly happened was that he, at that moment, decided to, what evangelicals call rededicate his life to Jesus. And that really became a turning point, and he then proceeded to run for governor again 4 years later and was successful. But yeah, doubt was very much part of that. And I think the other time was after he was defeated in 1980. It was a bitter election defeat. And we think of it today as a landslide for Reagan, and it was. But what people forget is that going into the final weekend of that campaign, polls showed Reagan and Carter neck and neck. Once again, Carter couldn't catch a break for anything. Election day itself coincided with the 1-year anniversary of the taking of the hostages in Iran. So over the weekend, the media were playing that up, the 1-year anniversary, and Carter's favorability over that weekend just plummeted, and so he lost and was quite disappointed. And Rosalynn in particular was very, very bitter about this. And in one of my conversations with Mr. Carter, he said one of the reasons that he was able to bounce back from that defeat was that he had to keep reassuring Rosalynn that life would go on. They still had a long lifetime ahead of them. They could do good things. And he said, after a while, I began to believe it myself.
When you write Redeemer, you're also referring to his post-presidency to some extent.
Certainly a redemption, absolutely. And he said, I don't think it's any secret, but he said that, he told me one of the conversations, he said that had he been reelected in 1980, it's very likely he would not have done many of the things that he did as an ex-president, as a former president. And historians have said it's the greatest, most remarkable post-presidency in American history, and I think it's pretty hard to argue with that.
You met him in, was it 2009? You were in Plains, Georgia, and went to his, was it roughly around there?
Could be. I don't remember. I don't remember what the year it was. Yeah. Well, but that was one of our meetings. Yeah.
First, Paul did you have a question, Paul?
Going back to the 1970s for a moment, at that Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern.
This is Jim Wallace, by the way.
Yeah.
He was there, so I'm.
So it was young evangelicals, some of us who wrote that. But in the room were centrist, mainstream, evangelical leaders like Carl Henry.
Carl Henry, yeah.
And Frank Gabeline, a whole bunch of, they joined us there. It wasn't just us young evangelicals.
Yeah.
And we were going back, Carl Henry and I were going back and forth about the final copy publicly. And we won them over. The idea that evangelical should be both personal gospel and social gospel. We won over the established leaders. And we never lost them. And what happened was, in fact, for 10 years, the journalistic story was young evangelicals are changing evangelicalism, making it a social gospel as well. But Richard Viguerie, who was Paul Weyrich's partner in all this, who was a Republican political operative like Weyrich, Richard Viguerie has boasted to me that he went to Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, who my dad, evangelical, thought was a fundamentalist, not an evangelical. And Weyrich, Viguerie said to them, "You give us your lists." Viguerie was the
Direct mail.
the direct mail guru of his time. You give us your lists, and, quote, we'll make you household words in America. That's what Viguerie said to me, boasting of how he got them in. So it was not a theological shift. It was a political takeover. A political takeover of evangelicals by Republican political operatives on the far right. Now that plays into today, but for 10 years, we young evangelicals thought we were changing evangelicalism. We were speaking at all the Christian colleges. We had the support of the heads of Christianity Today and Wheaton College and all that. We had all their support for this new direction, which was an old direction in terms of progressive evangelicals, abolition, women's suffrage, all the rest. But in that tradition, we were winning, and then there was a direct Republican political takeover using Falwell and Robertson, offering to make them famous, and they turned over their lists to Vigory, and that became the moral majority.
Interesting. And that coincided with the takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention in 1979, roughly the same time. A few years later, I guess.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, there's a funny story about that. After the takeover, there was a delegation of the new Southern Baptist leadership who visited Mr. Carter in the White House, and they had a conversation. And toward the end of the conversation, as they were leaving, one of them, I think it was Bailey Smith, turned to Mr. Carter and said, Mr. President, some of us are praying that you will give up your religion of secular humanism. And Carter that night went up to the residents in the White House and asked Rosalynn, what's secular humanism? That was the big buzzword for the religious right, and from Francis Schaeffer, actually, secular humanism.
David, you had a question.
I was going to ask. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. Jim Wallace just used the phrase that this declaration was a social as well as personal gospel. And this brought to me mind a question I wanted to ask about the origins that you traced of the early days of evangelical engagement with political issues in this country back in the late 19th and the early 20th century. This is the time in which, from the studies that I've done, I mean, what's called the social gospel emerged. Mm-hmm. Walter Rauschenbusch and folks like that. And Rauschenbusch was a Baptist, I believe. Mm-hmm. Did he have much to do with the origins of the evangelical movement that you're talking about? Because these days, the social gospel and evangelicalism are seen as contrary to each other. Yeah, and I'm just wondering about the history of this.
Actually, the roots of evangelical activism go back farther than that, to the antebellum period. It comes in the wake of the Second Great Awakening, particularly the Burned Over district in upstate New York. And that's when you have this kind of flourishing of evangelical social agencies and organizations. Peace crusades, for example. I've even run across a reference to a 19th century evangelical movement for gun control. Mm. So Rauschenbusch is later. That's the turn of the 20th century. And by that time, some of that activism is falling away. But actually, one of the champions for progressive evangelicalism at the turn of the 20th century is William Jennings Bryan. Mm-hmm. And we think of him today as being the sore loser of the Scopes trial, but he really was a progressive champion, at least up until the final years of his life, particularly on issues related to women and also workers' rights, the rights of workers to organize. So yeah, Rauschenbusch, yes, you're right. Today, social gospel and evangelicalism would be seen as two separate entities, but progressive evangelicals reject that bifurcation.
I mean, the term social gospel is actually used as a pejorative in
some
circles.
That's right. Yeah.
Paul, do you have a question?
Yes, quickly. So much to learn from you, Professor Balmer.
Thanks, Paul.
More than most people, Jimmy Carter gave more than most people in his position. Jimmy Carter gave sustained attention to the plight of Palestine and the Palestinians. Yeah. Can you present his position and spell out what it means for us today?
Oh. Tom Gjelten is here. He probably could do better than I could. But I mean, Carter was very much dedicated to the two-state solution to what's going on in the Middle East. And of course, he got a lot of flack for that from the Jewish community, with mainly the title of his book, Peace Not Apartheid, really inflamed a lot of folks in the Jewish community. But I think one of his great regrets, and there are several, about what was not carried on past his own presidency. One was the failure to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution, particularly for Rosalind. That was a bitter disappointment for her. But secondly, the failure of, frankly, all of his successors to build on the Camp David Accords that he had hammered out so tediously in 1979. So, and as far as I know, he continued to believe to the end of his life that the two-state solution was the only way forward in Israel.
But he did get into some trouble, didn't he, as an advocate of conflict resolution in different places. North Korea, I was in Bosnia. He tried to negotiate something there, and he ended up befriending Radovan Karadzic, who was not someone that you wanted to befriend. He got in some trouble in Nicaragua by befriending Daniel Ortega. Yeah. He did face some criticism for the judgments that he made. Yeah. In this
but I think also he was kind of working through the Carter Center, he was kind of a free agent in many ways, and often embarked on these diplomatic missions without the full blessing of the administration at the time. So, yeah.
Hello, I have a question. My name is Angelina Mosier Salazar. I'm a first-year MBA student here at Georgetown. Mr. Balmer, thank you so much for being here and sharing your wealth of knowledge on the history of the evangelical movement here in the United States, and for so many of the influential figures that we have here. As a young woman of color who was raised in the Southern Baptist tradition, I have to be quite honest that as of late, it's been embarrassing and almost a dirty word to call yourself an evangelical Christian. Yeah. I have to be very transparent about that. And I am heartened and hopeful with this talk by learning more of the history, and that this wasn't just an edict that was handed down to us at the current state of things. Could you talk about maybe where you see the movement going? I know you talked a little bit about, parishioners maybe filling in the church again and what your hopes are for the community. But please, for the younger generation, any words that you would like to leave us with?
Well, I usually beg off such questions by saying I'm a historian rather than a prognosticator, but it does. Yeah,
You're also a preacher.
I'm also a preacher, yeah, I suppose, right, yeah. But I think this is the moment for the prophetic voice. And this is a moment when the prophetic voice is coming from the margins. There's no question about that. And that it's a time when a voice like this if it's articulated with clarity and with purpose and with faith, I think it can be heard. So that's the basis for whatever hope I have right now is that there are people banding together. I mean, quite apart from faith, the thousands, maybe millions of people who have been demonstrating in the last couple of weeks is for me a sign of hope. And I also want to say that no act of conscience is negligible. As Tom said, I'm writing a biography of Mark Hatfield right now. Mark Hatfield, in 1965 and 1966, when he was governor of Oregon, was the only governor out of 50 to vote against a resolution in support of Lyndon Johnson's handling of the war in Vietnam. This despite the fact that Johnson put a great deal of pressure on him, and Johnson, we know something about how Johnson worked. He was fascinating individual. As Bill Moyer said, 13 of the most fascinating people he'd ever met. And at that time, in '66, Hatfield was the Republican nominee for Senate in Oregon at a time when Oregonians supported the Vietnam War 78%. And he was running for Senate that fall. Fast forward a couple of years later, 5, 6 years later, the entire country had come around to oppose the Vietnam War. You know, the real catalyst, I think, was the Kent State shootings in 1970. But nevertheless, you know, that was a lone voice of conscience at a time of unbelievable opposition. And, you know, he was governor, so he certainly was not a powerless individual, but, you know, that was an important act. So I think each act of conscience is not negligible. And the aggregate effect of those voices, I think, can tear down the walls of Jericho.
Can I speak to that last word about hope? Because I've got students so much like you who are asking that same question. And a lot of the nuns are coming back to finding their place.
The nuns, N-O-N-E-S.
The nuns, yeah. And to me, the line I would always use is, hope means believing in spite of the evidence, then watching the evidence change. And there's a new movement growing. We brought the social gospel back to evangelicalism. Now it's anathema. Well, the social gospel is coming back. And you're going to see that in this crisis now. David Brooks, of all people, in his Atlantic piece is called for a new social gospel. And a lot of us are in conversation around the country. And let's be clear, when we say evangelicals and how bad they are, it's white evangelicals, where the white defines evangelical. And black and Latino evangelicals are in a whole different place. So people of color who are evangelical, theologically, are in a very different place politically. And you add the white people who voted against Donald Trump, white evangelicals, with black and Hispanic, there are tens of millions of us now. We're not just small, we're not going away. I'm not as young anymore, but I'm not done. And a lot of us are organizing right now, and you're going to see this administration have to arrest clergy with collars and robes and stoles in defense of vulnerable people. And my hope is a crisis like this, the silver lining here, this could bring us back to faith in a way normal times don't. This isn't normal. And this crisis may bring a whole new generation back to faith. And I'm in touch with young pastors all the time who are young now like I was back then. And they want to fight, and we're going to fight. And so a new social gospel is coming back. So there's reason for hope.
Well, that's a good place to wind up this discussion. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you. Randall had to get up at, what was it, 2 o'clock this morning in the bitter cold of Hanover, New Hampshire.
That's right.
To make it down. So thanks for coming down, Randall.
My pleasure. Thanks
Thanks to all of you for coming out.
Thank you.